They wore crowns, but rarely grace. Behind palace gates and velvet curtains, the British royal family has housed more than a few saints, and far more spectacular sinners. This isn't about noble sacrifice or golden jubilees. This is about the petty, the power-hungry, the proudly unpleasant. From backstabbing monarchs to scandal magnet princes, these are the royals you won't find on the tea towels. 25 names, centuries of dysfunction, and not a single apology in sight. Because when you're born above the rules, breaking them becomes a royal tradition. Welcome to 25 biggest douchebags in British royal history. Before we dive headfirst into the velvet-lined chaos, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because nothing says quality time like a deep scroll through centuries of royal dysfunction. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you drifting off at midnight or hiding from responsibility at 3 p.m. sharp? We're dying to know who else is awake for this royal descent into madness. 1. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. If there were a royal family bingo card for worst-case PR disaster, Prince Andrew wouldn't just win, he'd own the board, flip the table, and demand a photo op with the pieces. The man who once held a promising military career and the title of Queen Elizabeth II's favorite son somehow managed to spiral into a walking cautionary tale about unchecked privilege, terminal obliviousness, and what happens when the aristocracy forgets the cameras never turn off. Prince Andrew, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, started life with all the makings of a respectable royal. He served as a helicopter pilot in the Falklands War, earning genuine praise for bravery. There was a time, believe it or not, when the tabloids referred to him as Randy Andy with a kind of mischievous admiration, not thinly veiled contempt. Back then, his romantic escapades were merely the stuff of late-night gossip columns and harmless scandals. Shoulder pads, yacht parties, questionable girlfriends. A proper 1980s royal cocktail. But time, as it often does, peeled back the charm and revealed something a bit less palatable. Namely, a man who appeared perpetually surprised by the concept of consequences. The trouble with Andrew isn't just in what he's accused of, although that's enough to make Buckingham Palace break into a collective flop sweat. It's how he's responded. In the court of public opinion, his greatest sin may not even be the associations with disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein, or the fact that he allegedly misused his position to rub elbows with billionaires in foreign palaces. No, the real clincher was how shockingly bad he was at pretending to care. The now infamous 2019 BBC Newsnight interview was supposed to be a moment of controlled image rehabilitation. What it became was the public relations equivalent of setting oneself on fire with a scented candle. In an effort to clear his name, Andrew instead offered what can only be described as a surreal string of alibis so bizarre they bordered on performance art. He claimed he couldn't have been at the nightclub where the alleged incident occurred because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking, and not just any visit, a very unusual trip, he emphasized, as if his loyalty to chain restaurants could somehow absolve him. Then came the sweating, or rather the lack thereof. Andrew stated that, due to a peculiar medical condition brought on by wartime stress, he was unable to sweat, a claim that seemed to defy both biology and dignity. The British public, usually unflappable in their tolerance for royal weirdness, blinked. This was new. This was something else. As the backlash mounted, the palace did what the palace does best: damage control via strategic retreat. Andrew was gently nudged, shoved out of public duties for the foreseeable future. Later, his military titles and royal patronages were stripped, and though he reached an undisclosed settlement in the lawsuit brought against him without admitting guilt, the cloud of scandal has never quite lifted. The tragicomic irony of Prince Andrew is that he seems utterly convinced of his own innocence, not necessarily in legal terms, but moral ones. In interviews and appearances, He projects the confused air of a man who can't understand why the world doesn't see him as he sees himself. Misunderstood? Loyal? A bit unlucky. It's a tone that says, "Why is everyone so upset? I'm still royal, aren't I?" But that's the crux of it. The thing about Andrew that makes him so unforgettable in the pantheon of royal missteps is how he exemplifies the most damning stereotype of monarchy. The idea that it breeds people so cocooned in privilege they genuinely believe accountability is optional. That power, soft or otherwise, is a birthright, not a responsibility. And unlike the tragic downfall of other royals, which tend to be laced with some degree of pathos, Andrew's story feels hollow. There's no grandeur, no noble sacrifice, no tragic flaw. Just a middle-aged man in a suit, blinking into a television camera, offering up a Pizza Express alibi to a nation that had long since stopped laughing. Which brings us, awkwardly, to the next name on our list. A woman so tone-deaf in public settings that even the most patient royal watchers had to wonder whether she was trolling them on purpose. Because if Prince Andrew is the face of catastrophic royal misjudgment, Princess Michael of Kent is the crown jewel of casually aristocratic rudeness. And she brought a little leopard print with her. 2. Princess Michael of Kent. If the British royal family were a dinner party, Princess Michael of Kent would be the guest who insists on bringing her own wine, complains about the seating arrangement, and somehow manages to insult the waiter, the host, and the concept of modernity all within her first 10 minutes at the table. She is not the most famous royal, and certainly not the most powerful, but she might be one of the most unintentionally revealing. Because in a monarchy that thrives on carefully constructed civility, she has always seemed determined to remind everyone that being polite is optional when you're certain you were born better than everyone else. Born Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz in what was then German-occupied Sudetenland, she married into the British royal family in 1978, joining as the wife of Prince Michael of Kent, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth II. But from the very beginning, the press seemed to sense something different about her. Pushy, they called her. Pretentious. And later, Princess Pushy became the affectionate insult that stuck, because it captured, perhaps too neatly, the peculiar cocktail of charm and condescension that followed her everywhere she went. Marie Christine was glamorous, fluent in several languages, and proudly European in a way that made British society both fascinated and suspicious. She could work a dinner table like an actress playing royalty, every gesture deliberate, every word sharp enough to cut glass. But the thing about being naturally theatrical is that people start to suspect that you think everyone else is part of your supporting cast. Her career as a public royal, a somewhat peripheral one, since she never had an official role in the firm, became a series of social faux pas that might have been funny if they weren't so revealing. One of her more notorious moments came in 2004, when she was accused of telling a table of black diners at a New York restaurant to go back to the colonies. She denied it, of course, and claimed that her words had been taken out of context. But the damage was done. The tabloids had their villain, and the public had their meme. When asked later about the incident, she attempted to clarify that she couldn't possibly be racist because she had once gone to Africa, and because, in her words, she had worked with African people. The explanation, if one can call it that, didn't help. It was the verbal equivalent of trying to put out a fire with a glass of champagne. Princess Michael has always seemed to occupy an unusual moral time zone, roughly 2 centuries behind everyone else. Her comments, interviews, and public statements often sound like they were transcribed from an Edwardian diary. She has been known to lament that modern royals have lost their mystique, to complain that commoners no longer show the proper deference, and to speak wistfully about the old Europe she believes she still represents. Even her choice of jewelry seems to have symbolic intent. When she attended a royal event in 2017 wearing a black amour brooch, a decorative piece depicting an African figure, widely considered racist, the internet went into meltdown. The fact that the event happened to be one attended by Meghan Markle, the first biracial member of the modern royal family, made it all the worse. The palace scrambled to downplay it. She later apologized, insisting she hadn't meant to offend anyone, that the brooch was a gift she'd worn many times before, which in some ways made it worse. Because that was precisely the problem. She didn't see why it might offend anyone in the first place. And that, perhaps, is what makes Princess Michael such an enduringly uncomfortable figure in the royal orbit. She isn't malicious in the cartoonish sense. She isn't scheming for power or plotting in the shadows of Buckingham Palace. She's simply oblivious. Blissfully, catastrophically oblivious. The kind of obliviousness that comes only from a lifetime of being told that one's opinions are synonymous with truth. There's also the matter of her endless self-comparisons to historical figures. She once referred to herself as a bit like Marie Antoinette, and not ironically. Another time, she compared the treatment of her husband, whose financial struggles led them to give up a grace and favor apartment in Kensington Palace, to the persecution of Tsar Nicholas II. There's a special talent in comparing losing a taxpayer-subsidized apartment to being executed by revolutionaries. But then, Marie Christine has always seen herself as a woman out of time, and occasionally out of touch with it. To her credit, there's a strange sort of purity in her lack of self-awareness. She says what she thinks. She moves through the world like an artifact that refuses to acknowledge it's in a museum. And perhaps that's why she fascinates, because she's proof that in the royal family, bad behavior isn't always scandalous. Sometimes it's just embarrassingly sincere. In the hierarchy of royal sins, Princess Michael's are not criminal. They are social. But in the age of global cameras and instant outrage, that's almost worse. She's the embodiment of a class system that can't quite understand why people stopped laughing at its jokes. And while the monarchy has spent decades trying to rebrand itself as relatable and progressive, she remains defiantly vintage, a living reminder that not every relic belongs in a glass case. And speaking of relics who mistake arrogance for destiny, the next royal on our list took the art of entitled behavior from private blunders to public spectacle. Before he became the world's most polarizing exile, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, was busy proving that even modern princes can be, well, royal pains. If you're still with us after that royal train wreck, you clearly have excellent taste in scandal, or at least a high tolerance for aristocratic awkwardness. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It's the modern equivalent of swearing fealty, but with fewer beheadings. And while you're here, tell us in the comments. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it as you listen? Are you night scrolling in New York or mid-commute in Melbourne? We want to know who else is lurking in the shadows of royal disgrace with us. 3. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. There was a time when Prince Harry was the fun one, the cheeky, lovable younger brother who made the monarchy look almost human. The one who didn't seem weighed down by centuries of duty, protocol, or the crushing existential boredom of ribbon-cutting ceremonies. He was the royal who laughed too loud, drank too much, and occasionally forgot that cameras existed. Britain adored him for it, right up until it didn't. The British press has always had a complicated relationship with its royals, but Harry was their favorite tabloid muse. He was photogenic, reckless, and conveniently available. A perfect cocktail for a nation that likes its aristocrats with a touch of self-destruction. But behind that boyish grin, there was always a flicker of volatility. The kind that doesn't quite fade, even under the weight of PR advisors and palace scripts. Harry's early years were tragic in ways that shaped his public and private selves forever. Losing his mother at such a young age, and then being forced to walk behind her coffin in front of millions, wasn't just cruel. It was psychologically defining. The world saw a boy trying to hold himself together, and later, a man trying to outrun that same public grief. But instead of sympathy, what he often got was headlines, the kind that sell papers by turning pain into punchlines. And so he grew up with two versions of himself, the soldier and the spectacle. On one hand, there was Harry the veteran, the man who served in Afghanistan, flew helicopters, and worked to modernize the image of military service. On the other, there was Harry the tabloid darling, the man who dressed up in ill-advised costumes, mouthed inappropriate jokes, and lived like a prince who thought the world was his personal after-party. The infamous Nazi costume incident in 2005, a party gone wrong, a photo gone viral, marked a turning point. Suddenly, the fun one became the foolish one. His apology came quickly, but the damage lingered. The public forgave him, as they tend to do with charming rogues, but something in the myth cracked. The monarchy, ever allergic to scandal, tightened the leash. For a while he seemed to settle. Military life gave him discipline, purpose, maybe even redemption. He became a different kind of royal, one with a mission, not just a title. His founding of the Invictus Games won real respect. For once, the headlines were kind. But the British press, like an old flame, couldn't resist the drama. Enter Meghan Markle, actress, humanitarian, and the spark that lit the most expensive public family feud since Henry VIII invented divorce. To some, their love story was modern and progressive. To others, it was betrayal, not of a person, but of an idea. Harry's decision to marry an outsider, and later to leave royal life altogether, felt to traditionalists like a rebellion against the very concept of monarchy. When he and Meghan gave their now infamous interview with Oprah, Harry's transformation was complete. Gone was the reckless party boy. In his place stood a man both bitter and bewildered. He spoke about feeling trapped, about the cruelty of the British tabloids, about the coldness of the institution itself. To many, it was a justified airing of grievances. To others, it was self-pity wrapped in Californian therapy speak. But here's where the irony bites. The man who had once mocked the system for being too stiff became one of its most outspoken critics only after leaving it. He traded palace walls for podcast microphones, royal duties for streaming deals. The rebel prince became a brand, a trademarked humanitarian wrapped in a Netflix glow. And while he claims to crave privacy, he seems oddly comfortable narrating every moment of his private life to a global audience. Perhaps that's what makes Prince Harry such a fascinating contradiction. He is both victim and villain, both the wounded child and the privileged adult who can't quite decide which role fits better. He rails against the institution that made him miserable, but he can't entirely let it go either. Every book, every interview, every public appearance circles back to the same paradox. The royal who hates being royal, but can't stop talking about it. In another era, Harry might have been forgotten, another tragic footnote in a long list of royal misfits. But in the social media age, he's immortalized as content. His every complaint becomes a trending topic. His every appearance, a meme. Whether one sees him as brave or bratty, sincere or spoiled, doesn't seem to matter anymore. What matters is that he keeps the story going. And in that, he is every bit his mother's son and his father's heir. Still, for all his chaos, Harry's wounds feel almost relatable. The struggle for identity, the rebellion against expectation. The next royal, though, offers none of that humanity. If Harry is the rebel prince, the next man was the original royal narcissist. A bloated symbol of indulgence whose reflection in every mirror was his only true love. Ladies and gentlemen, meet King George IV, the monarch who mistook gluttony for grandeur and vanity for virtue. 4. King George IV. If the British monarchy were a parade of self-indulgence dressed up in ermine, King George IV would be the float made entirely of mirrors. He wasn't just a man of excess, he was excess in human form. A living emblem of what happens when power, wealth, and unchecked vanity collide like carriages in a fog. While most kings are remembered for battles, reforms, or at least one decent quote, George IV is mostly remembered for being expensive, entitled, and catastrophically full of himself. He was born George Augustus Frederick in 1762, the eldest son of King George III. From the beginning, it was clear that little George was not destined for greatness so much as grandeur. Where his father was stern, serious, and mentally troubled, George the Younger was all silk stockings and velvet overcoats. He didn't want to reign, he wanted to be adored. His childhood was steeped in privilege, but also resentment. He loathed the constraints of royal life, especially the ones that involved responsibility. And so he made it his personal mission to turn his role into a spectacle. By his 20s, George had already cultivated a reputation for scandal. He secretly and illegally married Maria Fitzherbert, a Roman Catholic widow. A romantic move, perhaps, but one that violated the Royal Marriages Act. Parliament, unsurprisingly, refused to recognize the union, and George moved on with the emotional elegance of a spoiled actor changing agents. His official marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, arranged, strategic, and thoroughly miserable, was a farce from the start. He reportedly demanded brandy the night he met her and declared the next morning that he found her repulsive. The two despised each other openly, which made for excellent gossip and abysmal governance. George spent more time avoiding his wife than leading his country, and when he wasn't doing that, he was busy acquiring art, architecture, and astronomical debts. His love affair with fine living knew no bounds. His wardrobe could clothe a small village. He reportedly owned over 1,000 pairs of gloves. His dinners were elaborate, his lifestyle was a monument to appetite, and his refusal to curb either earned him the nickname the First Gentleman of Europe, though not always with admiration. Even his home, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, was a testament to his theatricality, an opulent, onion-domed fever dream of Eastern-inspired design. To George, it wasn't enough to live like a king. He wanted to live like every king, from every culture all at once. But beneath the silk and powdered wigs was a man deeply insecure and chronically dissatisfied. His reign as Prince Regent, a decade-long stint that began due to his father's mental illness, offered a rare glimpse of a royal given power without preparation. He took the job, but not the responsibility. His involvement in politics was minimal and self-serving. He didn't reform, didn't revolutionize, didn't rule so much as pose. When he finally became king in 1820, his popularity was already in decline. His treatment of Queen Caroline, who returned to England seeking recognition and was publicly humiliated for it, turned public opinion firmly against him. The people sided with the wife he had rejected, not because she was beloved, but because George had become so thoroughly dislikable. Cartoonists and satirists had a field day, lampooning him as bloated, lazy, and delusional. They weren't wrong. Even his own aides could hardly mask their disdain. One described him as, "A more contemptible, cowardly, selfish, unfeeling dog does not exist." It takes effort to inspire that kind of poetic contempt from someone paid to flatter you. And yet, for all his flaws, George IV gave Britain one unexpected gift: the clarity that even kings can be ridiculous. He shattered the myth of regal dignity by living out loud as a man who valued mirrors more than morality. His legacy is less about policy and more about spectacle, a walking cautionary tale in embroidered waistcoats. But if George IV was a peacock in a palace, flapping and preening his way through history, the next royal on our descent through dysfunction is a different breed of problem, less flamboyant, more treacherous. A man who gave up the crown for love, or so the legend goes, and spent the rest of his life trying to convince the world that was noble, not narcissistic. Brace yourself for King Edward VIII, whose abdication was just the opening act in a much darker royal drama. 5. King Edward VIII. Every royal scandal has its myth, the elegant lie that softens the harder truths. In the case of King Edward VIII, that myth is romantic, the noble king who gave up his throne for love, choosing a divorced American woman over the trappings of monarchy. Cue the swelling music, the wistful glances, the statue of self-sacrifice erected in the garden of public imagination. But the deeper you dig into Edward's life, the more that myth begins to rot at the edges. Because Edward didn't abdicate for love. Not really. He abdicated for himself. Born in 1894, Edward was the eldest son of King George V, and destined from birth to inherit the crown. Handsome, charming, and wildly popular in his youth, he was the first royal celebrity of the modern era. He cut a dashing figure, an image-conscious prince who toured the empire, posed for photographers, and cultivated the aura of a reluctant monarch-to-be. And that reluctance wasn't just for show. Edward loathed the idea of reigning. The duties, the constraints, the relentless monotony of being a figurehead, all of it bored him. He once said that becoming king would be utter hell, and when the time came, he proved it. The problem with Edward wasn't that he fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee who became, infamously, the reason for his abdication, but that he seemed completely uninterested in the actual responsibilities of kingship. Even before Wallis, Edward had shown a staggering lack of interest in governance, preferring nightclubs to briefings and parties to politics. His letters during his time as Prince of Wales are filled not with reflections on statecraft, but complaints about how exhausting royal protocol was and how much he'd rather be anywhere else. When George V died in 1936, Edward ascended the throne and almost immediately began dismantling it in spirit. He was impatient with tradition, dismissive of ministers, and openly flouted constitutional norms. His relationship with Wallis wasn't just a personal matter. It became a constitutional crisis. Marrying her would require government approval, and the government wasn't interested in bending the rules for a man who seemed to treat the monarchy like a temporary inconvenience. So Edward abdicated. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love," he said in his famous address. The nation swooned. The legend was born. But behind the noble phrasing was a man who had been looking for a way out long before Wallis entered the scene, and after he left, things only got more uncomfortable. As the Duke of Windsor, Edward lived a life of exile and expensive leisure. He never seemed particularly regretful about leaving the throne, only bitter that it didn't come with a better retirement package. He lobbied for cushy appointments, including a stint as governor of the Bahamas, where his main concerns seemed to revolve around poor service and insufficient luxury. Worse still were his alleged political sympathies. Declassified documents and credible historians have long suggested that Edward harbored a disturbing admiration for Nazi Germany. He visited Hitler in 1937. He toured German factories and military facilities. He smiled for the cameras. The exact depth of his sympathies remains debated, but one thing is clear: he was far too comfortable around authoritarianism for anyone's peace of mind. Some wartime officials suspected that the Germans saw him as a potential puppet king in the event of a successful invasion of Britain, a backup plan in a uniform. Even after the war, Edward's bitterness toward the royal family, and particularly his brother, King George VI, simmered. He published memoirs, gave interviews, and hosted a constant stream of minor controversies from his post-palace perch. The man who once had the world at his feet spent the rest of his life trying to convince that world he'd been right to walk away. What makes Edward VIII particularly infuriating isn't just his entitlement, it's the emptiness behind it. He had every advantage, every opportunity, and no idea what to do with them. He fled responsibility in the name of passion, then spent decades proving he didn't quite understand either. But if Edward was the king who left, the next royal on our descent into dysfunction was the one who stayed, through illness, instability, and the gradual collapse of his mental faculties. His name became shorthand for madness, but the truth is far messier than the caricature. Enter King George III, a monarch whose mind unraveled while the empire marched on. 6. King George III. For most people, King George III lives in cultural memory as a punchline, the mad king who lost America. A powdered wig in a Hamilton number, a monarch whose mental decline became the stuff of Broadway hooks and history memes. But as with most oversimplified legends, the reality is murkier, sadder, and considerably more unsettling. Because George III's reign wasn't just defined by what he lost, but by what he couldn't control: his mind, his court, and eventually, the narrative of his own rule. Born in 1738 and crowned in 1760, George ascended the throne at just 22, with all the wide-eyed idealism and rigid principles of a man determined not to become a puppet. He was the first Hanoverian monarch born in Britain, spoke English as a first language, and genuinely believed in the divine duty of the crown. But that belief, noble as it may sound, came with a price. George saw himself not as a figurehead, but as an active steward of moral order. And moral order, to him, looked suspiciously like personal obsession. In his early years, George was a surprisingly diligent ruler. He took his role seriously, even devoutly. He read the legislation. He met his ministers. He was a family man in an age of philandering kings, monogamous, earnest, even a little awkward. But lurking behind this image of stable domesticity was a man who could not, and would not then, adapt. He clung to power even as the world shifted beneath him. He saw compromise as weakness. And nowhere did this rigidity become more disastrous than in his dealings with the American colonies. The loss of the American Revolution wasn't solely his fault. Parliament, taxation policy, and military miscalculations all played their part. But George took it personally. He saw rebellion not as political disagreement, but as moral betrayal. He couldn't fathom that subjects might reject him not because they were disloyal, but because they wanted autonomy. In letters and decrees, his tone hardened. He viewed negotiation as surrender. Diplomacy became impossible. And when the war was lost, George reportedly considered abdication, not because he thought he'd failed, but because he couldn't stomach the idea that his authority wasn't absolute. But even the king's political stubbornness pales in comparison to what came next, the slow, public unraveling of his mental health. Historians still debate the exact cause: porphyria, bipolar disorder, severe stress compounded by genetic predisposition. Whatever the diagnosis, the symptoms were hard to ignore. He would talk incessantly for hours, often to no one. His letters veered into unintelligible spirals. He lost touch with his surroundings, ranted at courtiers, and at times had to be physically restrained. For a monarch who'd once prided himself on self-control and reason, it was a cruel and ironic collapse. And yet, even in his lucid moments, George clung to power. The Regency Act was passed only when it became undeniable that he could no longer rule. And even then, only after political arm-twisting. His son, the future George IV, was installed as Prince Regent, beginning a decade of ceremonial cohabitation between a mentally incapacitated father and an indulgent, vain heir. George III spent his final years in isolation at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and almost completely disconnected from reality. He outlived many of his children, his beloved wife Charlotte, and the political world he once tried to command. When he died in 1820, at the age of 81, Britain was a different place. The empire was expanding, the monarchy was evolving, and the image of the king, once synonymous with divine wisdom, was permanently altered. What makes George III compelling isn't just his descent into madness, but how that madness mirrored the monarchy itself. Powerful, inflexible, and increasingly out of touch. His reign marked the end of one kind of kingship and the reluctant beginning of another, one where rulers had to look a little more like people and a little less like gods. But while George's tragedy was largely internal, our next royal's dysfunction played out in the open, loud, theatrical, and soaked in scandal. She was alternately pitied, reviled, and laughed at by the very court that made her queen. A woman scorned by a nation and locked in a grotesque marriage of mutual loathing. Meet Queen Caroline of Brunswick, the royal wife no one wanted, least of all her own husband. 7. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. In the tragicomedy of British royalty, Queen Caroline of Brunswick was the woman caught in the world's messiest slow-motion divorce, and the world, unfortunately, was invited to watch. She was married to a man who detested her, smeared by a court that resented her, and paraded through the tabloids of her time like an early 19th century soap opera character. Depending on who you ask, she was either a sainted victim or a scandalous spectacle, and somehow she managed to be both. Born in 1768 into the German nobility, Caroline was matched with George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, in one of those cold, practical royal marriages where emotional compatibility was considered optional and political convenience was everything. The matchmakers expected at least a public show of unity. What they got instead was instant mutual revulsion. George reportedly demanded alcohol just to endure their wedding night, and later claimed he was so drunk he barely remembered it. Caroline wasn't particularly impressed either, noting, in writing, that her husband was fat, pale, and had bad teeth. Charming start. But despite their contempt, the marriage did produce one child, Princess Charlotte, and once that duty was fulfilled, the couple effectively separated. Caroline was packed off into semi-exile, and George went back to his lifestyle of wine, women, and deeply unnecessary waistcoats. For a time, Caroline seemed content to live her life apart from the court. She traveled, entertained freely, and was known to behave in ways that made the royal establishment deeply uncomfortable. She was loud, unfiltered, and delightfully unconcerned with what anyone thought of her. This alone might have sealed her fate. Royal women, especially the ones cast out, were expected to vanish quietly. Caroline did the opposite. She surrounded herself with eccentrics, foreign companions, and a fair number of men, many of whom were accused of being more than just friendly visitors. Whispers of infidelity turned into formal investigations. The most infamous of these was the Delicate Investigation of 1806, a name that sounds like a polite dinner party, but was actually a quasi-legal inquiry into whether Caroline had borne an illegitimate child. The result? Officially inconclusive, publicly humiliating. Still, she remained legally the Princess of Wales. And eventually, when George ascended to the throne in 1820, she became queen. Or at least, she tried to. George, now King George IV, was desperate to keep her out. He petitioned for a divorce, tried to bar her from the coronation, and even supported a bill in Parliament, the Pains and Penalties Bill, that would have stripped her of her title on the grounds of adultery. The entire episode played out like a constitutional circus. Caroline returned to England to defend herself and was met with an odd kind of public enthusiasm. Crowds gathered to support her. Pamphlets were printed. Queen Caroline Forever became the chant of the disaffected. To the working classes, she was a symbol, not necessarily of virtue, but of resistance. If George IV was the bloated emblem of royal hypocrisy, Caroline became the messy, flawed heroine standing in opposition to it. But Caroline was no saint. Her behavior, while bold, was often erratic. She made poor political decisions, surrounded herself with dubious advisors, and struggled to play the part of the virtuous wronged woman the public wanted her to be. She was inconsistent, reactive, and just as willing to sling mud as her enemies were. Her attempted entrance into Westminster Abbey on the day of the coronation became the stuff of royal farce. Denied entry at every door, she circled the building in a carriage, refused again and again until she finally gave up. A queen by law but not in ceremony, a theatrical rejection that summed up her entire place in the monarchy. Caroline died just a few weeks later, in August 1821, of an illness worsened by stress and public humiliation. Her tombstone bore the inscription, "Here lies Caroline of Brunswick, the injured Queen of England." Even in death, she made sure the monarchy couldn't forget her. Caroline's legacy is uncomfortable because it forces us to ask, what happens when both sides in a royal feud are unlikable? She wasn't a model queen, but she wasn't meant to be. She was, in the end, a symptom of a royal system built to serve appearance, not humanity. And if Caroline was a rebellious flame flickering at the edges of monarchy, the next man in our descent burned the whole house down, and then wondered why the windows shattered. Rigid, humorless, and terrifyingly convinced of his own righteousness, King Charles III wasn't just unpopular. He was divisive enough to ignite a civil war. 8. King Charles I. If British monarchs were judged on their ability to read the room, King Charles I would be remembered as a man who stared straight into the fire and called it candlelight. He wasn't flamboyant like George IV, or tragically human like George III. No, Charles was something far more dangerous. A devout believer in his own divine authority, so tightly wound in formality and ritual that he seemed allergic to the concept of compromise. His reign wasn't just a slow-motion disaster. It was a masterclass in how to take a powder keg of political tension and strike it with a ceremonial scepter. Born in 1600, Charles was the second son of King James I and never expected to inherit the throne. But after the death of his older brother, he became heir apparent and was crowned king in 1625. Where his father had been flamboyant and philosophical, Charles was reserved and deeply pious. He walked through his reign with the bearing of a man who believed that he had not just royal blood, but divine instruction. That kind of thinking makes for great paintings, but terrible politics. From the start, Charles was at odds with Parliament. He believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and thus not answerable to anyone, least of all a bunch of elected officials in wigs. Parliament, increasingly populated by men with money, influence, and revolutionary ideas about accountability, disagreed. The clash was ideological, but it quickly became personal. One of Charles's most infamous decisions was to dissolve Parliament entirely in 1629, initiating an 11-year period known as the Personal Rule. It sounds calm. It wasn't. During this time, Charles attempted to govern without legislative consent, relying instead on ancient taxes, unpopular levies, and deeply questionable financial tricks to fund his court. Unsurprisingly, this did not go over well with the public. Taxation without representation, it turns out, doesn't sit any better in London than it did in Boston. Worse still was his religious policy. Charles was a devout Anglican with a Catholic-leaning queen, Henrietta Maria of France. He appointed bishops who leaned high church, angering Puritans and reformers across the country. The result? A nation that already felt politically ignored now also felt spiritually betrayed. England became a pressure cooker of suspicion, economic strain, and sectarian anxiety, all under the control of a king who seemed more interested in ceremony than strategy. Eventually, the tension exploded into civil war. The Royalists, loyal to Charles, faced off against the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell and his iron-willed band of reformers. It was not just a battle for power, it was a referendum on monarchy itself. Charles, ever the believer in divine right, refused to negotiate in good faith. He was imprisoned, released, and imprisoned again. He made secret deals, broke them, and then acted surprised when no one trusted him. In 1649, after years of war and failed negotiations, Charles was put on trial for treason, a shocking moment in a world where kings weren't supposed to answer to anyone but God. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. That moment, a king judged by his subjects, was unprecedented in English history. But here's where the story takes a twist. Rather than show remorse or humility, Charles used the trial to perform one final act of theatrical dignity. He carried himself with calm, almost smug poise. To the very end, he insisted he was right, not politically, but spiritually. And in a way, he got what he wanted: martyrdom. Monarchists would remember him as St. Charles the Martyr, but most remembered him as the man whose arrogance cost the crown everything. at least temporarily. Charles I wasn't evil. He was worse than that. Inflexible. In a time of immense change, he was a statue trying to stop a landslide. His downfall was not the result of any one act, but of a consistent, unwavering belief that he didn't have to change, because God had chosen him. The problem was, the people had started to think God might have changed his mind. And if Charles was the monarch who shattered the crown by clinging to it too tightly, the next one simply reshaped the throne in his own image, violent, charismatic, and pathologically convinced that his appetites were destiny. Because where Charles lost his head, King Henry VIII made a habit of keeping his, while ensuring others were far less fortunate. 9. King Henry VIII. Every monarchy has its titan, the larger-than-life figure who dominates every painting, every policy, every historical footnote. For Britain, that man is King Henry VIII. He wasn't just a king, he was a brand, a one-man medieval power surge wrapped in velvet, jewels, and deeply questionable moral logic. Even now, centuries later, his name conjures images of thrones, thundering banquets, and the slow march of doomed wives. But beneath the swagger and splendor was a ruler whose reign blurred the lines between personal desire and national policy, and whose worst qualities weren't just tolerated, but enshrined. Born in 1491 as the second son of Henry VII, young Henry wasn't supposed to be king. But when his older brother Arthur died unexpectedly, the crown landed on his head at the tender age of 17, and he wore it like a boy trying on his father's coat, with excitement, entitlement, and absolutely no idea how big it was. At first, Henry was everything a Renaissance prince should be: athletic, educated, charming. He could joust, compose music, write poetry, and speak multiple languages. He was also deeply insecure, a trait that aged poorly. He inherited a stable realm and promptly set about turning it into the backdrop for his own grand opera, in which he was forever the noble hero betrayed by those who didn't understand his divine brilliance. But it was his obsession with producing a male heir that would define and deform his legacy. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. Henry saw this as a cosmic insult, a flaw in the divine order. What followed was a political and religious earthquake that reshaped England forever. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry broke from the Catholic Church entirely, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a bold move, revolutionary even, but not for theological reasons. It was, at its core, a legal workaround so he could remarry. And remarry he did. 6 times, in fact. Each new wife was a gamble, a pivot, a political maneuver disguised as romance. And each time things didn't go as planned, someone else paid the price. Yet the myth of Henry as merely a tyrant misses the deeper dysfunction. He wasn't just ruthless, he was deeply reactive. Paranoid, alternately trusting and vindictive. He built up his advisors only to destroy them. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn. All were elevated, then discarded when they no longer fit the story Henry wanted to tell. It wasn't about loyalty or competence. It was about proximity to the throne, and how quickly that proximity became lethal. By the later years of his reign, Henry was unrecognizable from the golden-haired youth of his coronation. He was bloated, isolated, and riddled with ailments, both physical and political. His once vibrant court became a paranoid echo chamber, with whispers of treason never far from the velvet curtains. His moods swung unpredictably, his justice was arbitrary, and his capacity for reflection appeared non-existent. Still, he left behind a country permanently altered: the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, a new breed of nationalism. In many ways, Henry modernized the monarchy, not by design, but by force. He created a state that revolved around the crown, not the church, around his will, not Rome's, and future monarchs would inherit not just his lineage, but his blueprint for personal rule disguised as national destiny. But Henry's real legacy is less about power and more about how easily power excuses everything else. He was selfish, unpredictable, and often unjust. And yet he remains one of Britain's most iconic rulers. His reign proves that charisma can rewrite history, that force can masquerade as leadership, and that a crown can turn appetite into doctrine. And while Henry ruled through sheer force of personality, the royal who followed in his long historical shadow was quieter, subtler, but no less complicated. In a court plagued by illness, favoritism, and quiet manipulation, Queen Anne stood at the center, isolated, grieving, and haunted by power she never quite seemed to want. 10. Queen Anne. Queen Anne didn't roar like Henry VIII or spark revolutions like Charles I. She didn't scandalize the empire or throw wild banquets in glittering palaces. No, Anne ruled in a different key, quieter, sadder, and laced with the kind of melancholy that clings to tapestries and echoes through drafty throne rooms. Her reign was not marked by drama, but by discomfort. She was the monarch who never quite seemed comfortable with being one. Born in 1665, the daughter of James II, Anne came to the throne in 1702 after a series of dynastic shuffleboard moves that kept Britain Protestant, whether it liked it or not. She was the last of the Stuarts, and her reign saw the official formation of Great Britain. A unifying moment that felt, in retrospect, oddly detached from the woman who technically made it happen. Because Anne didn't lead like a revolutionary. She led like someone trying very hard not to fall apart. By the time she was crowned, Anne had endured more personal loss than most royal biographies dare to count. She suffered from chronic illness her entire life, possibly lupus or a similar autoimmune condition, and experienced at least 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a surviving heir. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and children who died in infancy created a kind of private grief that hung around her like fog. Her body failed her again and again, while the nation watched and whispered. She found solace in companionship, most famously with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, whose influence over Anne has been dramatized and dissected for centuries. Their friendship, or relationship, depending on who's interpreting, was intense, codependent, and eventually explosive. Sarah was sharp, politically savvy, and unapologetically ambitious. Anne was softer, more reserved, and seemingly desperate for love she could trust. Together, they formed one of the most emotionally fraught power duos in royal history. But the closeness unraveled. Sarah's ambition grated against Anne's increasing desire for independence. Letters turned cold, affection turned to power plays. Eventually, Sarah was dismissed, and a new favorite, Abigail Masham, stepped in. What followed was a slow burn of court drama, backroom maneuvering, and passive-aggressive policymaking that would make a modern political thriller seem understated. Yet despite the emotional chaos, Anne did govern, or at least preside, during a significant period. Her reign oversaw the Act of Union, the War of the Spanish Succession, and the rise of the two-party system in Parliament. She supported the Church of England, mistrusted the Whigs, and leaned into Tory ideals with a kind of vague loyalty more emotional than ideological. But she was never a natural politician. Her speeches were stiff. Her presence at court was subdued, and her reputation, even in her own time, was one of awkward reserve. By the end of her life, she was obese, frequently bedridden, and largely isolated. Courtiers mocked her behind closed doors. Ministers manipulated her preferences. The monarchy endured, but its figurehead seemed increasingly absent. When she died in 1714, childless and exhausted, it marked the end of a dynasty. Her body was carried to its grave by 12 guards, not out of honor, but because no fewer could lift her. Anne's reign was not disastrous, but it was undeniably uncomfortable. She was not cruel or scandalous, just tragically unfit for the weight of the crown, a queen without heirs, a ruler without confidence, a monarch whose most lasting impression may be how deeply human she was, and how ill-suited that humanity was to royal expectation. And if Anne ruled from the shadows of her own sorrow, the next royal on our list charged headfirst into those shadows with champagne in one hand and scandal in the other. Meet Prince George IV. Again, only this time, we're digging deeper into the man behind the powdered face, and just how thoroughly he turned royal dignity into a punchline. 11. Prince George IV. Prince George IV was the kind of royal whose life felt less like a reign and more like a long-running tabloid column, ghost-written by excess and edited by debt collectors. We've met him once already, back when he was masquerading as a future monarch during his disastrous marriage to Caroline of Brunswick. But his second act, as king, deserves its own separate file under historical facepalms. Because George IV didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited the full toolkit of royal irresponsibility and wielded it like a golden ladle at a dessert buffet. By the time he officially became king in 1820, George had already spent nearly a decade as Prince Regent, filling in for his father, George III, who had descended into incapacitating mental illness. But the title Regent had done nothing to temper George's worst instincts. If anything, it gave him the appearance of power without the accountability of rule, and he treated it as such. As Prince Regent, he transformed politics into theater, court life into a costume drama, and his own image into a carefully curated painting, often literally. He surrounded himself with opulence that even his contemporaries found embarrassing. Everything he touched became gilded, upholstered, or unnecessarily French. His taste was undeniable, if completely unmoored from moderation. The Brighton Pavilion, his seaside pleasure palace, was a fever dream of Eastern-inspired architecture, domes, dragons, and decor that made Versailles look minimalist. It was beautiful, yes, but also bloated, much like its owner. As king, George IV was known less for governance and more for avoidance. He famously refused to attend his own coronation banquet. His excuse? Ill health. The more likely reason? He couldn't stomach being in a room full of people who knew what he had done to his wife Caroline, who had recently died under circumstances still debated today. Public sentiment had turned against him dramatically. The once dashing prince had become, in the eyes of many, a vain, self-pitying monarch whose physical decay seemed to mirror his political irrelevance. And there was plenty of decay. George's health deteriorated quickly, owing to years of gluttony, drinking, and general disregard for his body. He was massively overweight, chronically inflamed, and in constant pain. He wore corsets to hold himself upright and insisted on absurd amounts of flattery from his courtiers, who were expected to pretend that the king, now barely mobile, was still the embodiment of royal dignity. Politically, he was disengaged. He resisted the growing tide of reform sweeping through the country, preferring the company of sycophants to that of ministers. He loathed the press, distrusted Parliament, and saw the public not as his subjects, but as a nuisance. His correspondence is filled with self-justifying laments, bitter recollections, and dramatic exaggerations of slights, both real and imagined, and yet despite all this, there was something performatively tragic about George IV. Beneath the layers of brocade and bombast was a deeply insecure man, haunted by his own reputation and desperate to control it. He commissioned endless portraits, hoping to freeze in time the youthful version of himself long since vanished. He curated his legacy with the precision of a man who knew that history was going to be unkind, and wanted to bribe it in advance. When he died in 1830, few mourned. The Times famously wrote that there had never been an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures. It was a cruel obituary, and a brutally accurate one. George IV didn't destroy the monarchy, but he certainly dented it. He lived as if the throne were a prop, not a responsibility. His greatest talent was self-parody, and his reign stands as a cautionary tale of what happens when royal identity is built entirely on performance. But while George IV floundered under the weight of his own vanity, the next king came from a different mold. A sailor-turned-sovereign whose rough manners and sharp temper turned Buckingham Palace into something closer to a dockside pub. Meet King William IV, the monarch who tried to rule with sailor's grit, and ended up leaving the monarchy caught between two centuries, and two very different ideas of royalty. 12. King William IV. If King George IV was a monarch sculpted from velvet, wine, and powdered denial, then King William IV was the opposite. All grit, bristle, and sea air. The so-called Sailor King never truly escaped the smell of salt water and gunpowder, and by the time he stumbled into the crown in 1830, he was already a relic of another age. He didn't look like a king, he didn't act like a king, and by most accounts, he didn't particularly enjoy being one. But history gave him the job anyway, and what followed was a reign marked by awkward decency, unintended reform, and the kind of undignified honesty that royal PR teams now spend millions to erase. Born in 1765, William was the third son of King George III and spent most of his life assuming he'd never be king. This gave him the rare royal luxury of being largely ignored. He joined the Royal Navy at 13 and actually served, like really served, in battles, on deck, enduring storms, rank, and the kind of violence that polished princes usually only read about. He loved the Navy. It gave him structure, authority, and a purpose far removed from the powdered absurdity of court life. But William's naval background also left its mark in other ways. He was blunt, often crass, and completely lacking in the polished affectations expected of royalty. He swore. He interrupted ministers mid-sentence. He told inappropriate stories at dinner. He had very little patience for ceremony, and even less for the kind of political tap dancing that defined court politics. This earned him both praise and quiet alarm. He was, in many ways, the first monarch in generations to seem too normal. And yet, for all his plainness, William had a private life as messy and theatrical as any of his predecessors. He lived for 20 years with his mistress, the actress Dorothea Jordan, and fathered 10 illegitimate children with her, the Fitz-Clarences. While he eventually married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen for dynastic purposes, he remained deeply attached to his first family, a fact that didn't sit well with the palace elite. When he became king at the age of 64, mostly because his older brothers had either died or failed to produce legitimate heirs, William brought that same casual unpredictability to the throne. He was deeply involved in politics, not always to the benefit of stability. His views were contradictory, sometimes progressive, often reactionary, and always passionately delivered. He supported some democratic reforms, like the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, yet resisted others, like expanding the vote. The biggest political drama of his reign was the reform crisis of 1831-32. Parliament was on the verge of collapse over proposals to extend voting rights to more of the middle class. William, caught between reformers and conservatives, initially played the peacemaker. But when things spiraled, he did the very unkingly thing of threatening to flood the House of Lords with new pro-reform peers if they didn't pass the bill. It worked, just barely. But it revealed something unusual about William. When forced to choose between the aristocracy and avoiding a revolution, he begrudgingly chose the latter. Still, his temper was legendary. He once stormed out of a cabinet meeting and declared that he didn't understand half of what these blasted lawyers are talking about. At state events, he would ramble off script, complain about speeches being too long, and sometimes insult foreign dignitaries without even realizing it. Diplomacy for William was optional. Manners were conditional. He reigned for just 7 years, dying in 1837, but in that short span, he managed to drag the monarchy, kicking and coughing, into the Victorian era. He wasn't brilliant, he wasn't graceful, but he was honest in a way that most kings aren't. sometimes brutally so. And if William IV was the unvarnished sailor king, the next monarch was his polished, indulgent nephew, a man whose appetites rivaled Henry VIII's, but with a veneer of Edwardian charm and a talent for making vice look fashionable. Enter King Edward VII, the playboy prince who finally got the throne and brought his tailor with him. 13. King Edward VII. King Edward VII spent most of his life waiting for the throne, for respect, and, perhaps most notably, for someone to take him seriously. By the time he became king in 1901 at the age of 59, he had waited longer than any heir in British history. And like a man finally called to the stage after decades in the lobby, he walked in with champagne breath, monogrammed cufflinks, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew the party didn't start until he arrived. Born in 1841 as the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Edward, known to friends and enemies alike as Bertie, was a disappointment from the start. His parents were stern, intellectual, and deeply moralistic. Bertie was not. Where his father was a model of industrious Germanic efficiency, Bertie preferred hunting, gambling, and the company of actresses. He wasn't unintelligent, just completely uninterested in the kind of life his parents wanted for him. And Queen Victoria never let him forget it. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria blamed her son, indirectly, irrationally, and perpetually. She believed his immoral behavior had caused the stress that contributed to Albert's early death. From that moment on, their relationship soured into something cold and ceremonial. Victoria withdrew from public life and largely froze Bertie out of any real influence. For nearly 40 years, he existed as the most famous man in Britain with absolutely nothing to do. He filled the time in predictably extravagant fashion. Bertie became a fixture of high society across Europe. He was known for his charm, his laughter, his ability to eat 8-course meals without flinching, and his impressive, some might say industrial, capacity for pleasure. Paris was his second home. He dined with courtesans, smoked cigars like oxygen, and once had a custom love seat designed to accommodate his larger-than-life lifestyle in the most literal sense. But beneath the excess, there was strategy. Bertie understood people. He had an instinct for diplomacy, even if he lacked formal power. While Victoria sulked in castles, Bertie worked rooms. He built friendships with foreign leaders, disarmed rivals with charisma, and essentially created the model of the modern soft power royal, all while being dismissed as a lightweight. When Victoria finally died in 1901, Bertie ascended the throne as King Edward VII. And to the surprise of many, he wasn't terrible at it. He brought a new energy to the monarchy, easing some of the stiffness left behind by his mother's endless mourning. He traveled widely, hosted lavish state events, and used his social skills to smooth over diplomatic tensions, especially between Britain and France. The Entente Cordiale, a historic agreement between the two nations, was due in part to Edward's personal charm offensive. Still, old habits die hard. His reign, though short, was peppered with scandals. He gambled at private clubs, left unpaid debts, and was whispered to have fathered more children than he acknowledged. He famously had a chair built with a cutout seat to accommodate his expanding waistline during affairs. It sounds like a joke, but the chair exists. That's the legacy he left. One part king, one part caricature. Edward VII died in 1910 after just 9 years on the throne, and the obituaries struggled to strike a tone. He had been both a disappointment and a revelation. A decadent hedonist who somehow ushered in an era of elegance. His court was dubbed the Marlborough House set, all silk, scandal, and cigars. And yet, for all his flaws, he made the monarchy look human again. Flawed, yes, but relatable in its appetite for life. But if Edward's sins were dressed in silk and scented with cologne, the next royal carried hers like a steel corset beneath layers of mourning black. a woman both idolized and, in private, feared. Queen Victoria ruled not just an empire but a family that often felt more like a battlefield. 14. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria ruled over a quarter of the world's landmass and a fair portion of its moral compass, yet somehow couldn't rule over her own emotions, or her famously dysfunctional family. She has been immortalized as the stern matriarch of the British Empire, the widow in eternal black, the symbol of propriety and restraint. But strip away the statues, stamps, and sugar-coated schoolbook mythology, and what remains is a ruler as complex as she was contradictory, sentimental yet domineering, deeply devoted yet emotionally punishing, and not nearly as amused as legend would suggest. Born in 1819 and ascending the throne at the age of 18, Victoria was never meant to be a monarch. But a series of sudden deaths and dynastic dead ends placed her at the helm of an empire about to balloon into global dominance. Her early reign had a romantic sheen, part fairy tale, part constitutional drama. She fell deeply in love with her cousin Prince Albert, married him against her advisor's better judgment, and proceeded to become a kind of Victorian power couple, blending domestic bliss with royal PR. But the fairy tale ended when Albert died of typhoid in 1861, leaving Victoria shattered. She retreated from public life almost entirely, plunging the monarchy into a long shadow of grief. She wore mourning black for the rest of her life. For over a decade, she avoided state duties, causing frustration and resentment across government and public circles. The country continued functioning, but the Queen was largely absent, physically present, politically ghosted. What replaced her public presence was private influence, often overbearing, often emotional. Her letters to her children are filled with melodrama and moral scolding. She played favorites, then turned on those favorites when they stepped out of line. She simultaneously clung to her offspring and meddled in their lives with such fervor that it strained many of those relationships beyond repair. Her son Bertie, later Edward VII, bore the brunt of her disappointment. She considered him idle, shallow, and unworthy of the crown. He, in turn, resented her control and spent most of his adult life waiting to be free from it. Politically, Victoria had more power than she liked to admit. Though technically a constitutional monarch, she was not shy about expressing her opinions on ministers, wars, and morality. She disapproved of Gladstone, adored Disraeli, and frequently inserted herself into matters of state through back-channel letters and emotional appeals. Her version of ruling was less about decree and more about pressure, subtle when necessary, suffocating when not. Her personal biases also shaped imperial policy. She had a soft spot for India, though her affection was often tangled in colonial fantasy. She took an Indian servant, Abdul Karim, as a close confidant, scandalizing the court and prompting whisper campaigns. It wasn't the relationship itself that shocked. Royals were no strangers to favoritism. But the fact that she treated someone from outside the aristocracy as emotionally and politically significant. Her court was furious. She didn't care. Despite being celebrated as the embodiment of Victorian virtue, Victoria herself often failed to live up to the image. She could be petulant, obsessive, and alarmingly cold to those closest to her. Her grief became identity, her authority, personal. What she left behind was a monarchy drenched in contradiction, expanded and glorified on the world stage, but inwardly brittle, bruised by the very woman who had tried to make it unbreakable. And if Victoria ruled with sentiment weaponized as strategy, the next king brought no such depth, only discipline, silence, and a frost that seeped into the bones of his family. Enter King George V, a man so emotionally withheld and regimentally rigid, even his children feared the sound of his footsteps down the hall. 15. King George V. If King Edward VII was the playboy turned surprisingly effective monarch, his son, King George V, was the exact opposite, stern, dry, and allergic to personal flair. Where Edward embodied indulgence, George preferred formality. Where Edward laughed, George frowned. And where his father cultivated charm, George cultivated fear, particularly within his own household. He didn't command loyalty by charisma. He earned it by being the kind of man whose silence could empty a room. Born in 1865 as the second son of Edward VII, George was never intended to be king. That role was meant for his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, the charming but unreliable heir who died suddenly in 1892, throwing George into the spotlight. He was plucked from a naval career, which he genuinely loved, and dropped into the polished cage of royalty, where spontaneity goes to die and tradition is an occupational hazard. George was not a visionary. He didn't rewrite the monarchy or challenge its foundations. He maintained it, preserved it, hardened it into something unyielding. And in the process, he became the template for the modern British monarch, emotionally distant, politically neutral, and stubbornly reliable. His reign, beginning in 1910, was marked by seismic global events: the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the collapse of European monarchies. Through it all, George remained a figure of cold, unwavering continuity. He didn't inspire exactly, but he endured, and for a shaken British public, that was enough. But his lack of warmth wasn't just public, it was deeply personal. George was famously strict with his children, particularly his sons. He saw any sign of softness as weakness, any sign of rebellion as disloyalty. His relationship with his heir, the future Edward VIII, was notoriously strained. George thought Edward was unserious, self-indulgent, and too fond of American divorcees. He was right, but his way of showing concern was through rigid disapproval and emotional distance. The irony, of course, is that George V's greatest act of royal clarity came not through leadership, but through rebranding. During World War I, amid anti-German sentiment, he changed the royal family's name from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor. It was a brilliant move. Superficial, yes, but symbolically powerful. It told the public that the king stood with them, not with distant cousins in Berlin. Yet behind this savvy move lay a man who still thought and ruled like a Victorian. He once wrote in his diary that he dreaded weekends because they meant time with his family. His children feared him. His court tiptoed around him. He was a man of duty, certainly, but also of astonishing emotional stinginess. When the Russian royal family, his cousins, begged for asylum during the Bolshevik Revolution, George initially agreed, then quietly reversed the decision, fearing public backlash. Romanovs were later executed. The moral cost of that decision haunted the crown, but not visibly George. Whether he regretted it or compartmentalized it is anyone's guess. But he never spoke of it again. George V died in 1936, exhausted and suffering from chronic illness. His final years were defined by disappointment in his heir and the quiet satisfaction that, despite everything, the monarchy had survived. Not grown, not evolved, just survived. And as it turned out, survival was the easy part. Because while George ruled with cold precision, the next royal in our descent was far less careful. A man whose sharp tongue, careless remarks, and relentless foot-and-mouth moments made him both legendary and exasperating. Enter Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the consort who never quite learned to whisper. 16. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. If Queen Elizabeth II was the unflinching face of British continuity, then Prince Philip was the unfiltered voice behind her, sometimes witty, sometimes wise, and often wildly inappropriate. He was the royal family's unofficial commentator, bodyguard, critic, and occasional liability, depending on the day and the headline. Over his 7-decade tenure as consort, he said the quiet part out loud more often than not, giving royal aides a lifetime supply of headaches and tabloid editors a gift that kept on giving. Born in 1921 on a kitchen table in Corfu, because royal births abroad don't always come with palaces, Philip's early life was chaotic. He was born into Greek and Danish royalty, but exiled before he could crawl. His childhood was a transcontinental shuffle. France, Germany, Britain, often marked by separation from his parents and a constantly shifting identity. By the time he married Elizabeth in 1947, he was equal parts royal, refugee, sailor, and stray. The British establishment saw him as foreign, arrogant, and insufficiently deferential. Three qualities he never really shed, to their ongoing discomfort. Philip's military service in the Royal Navy during World War II gave him structure, discipline, and a firm belief that duty was best done without complaint, a value he never stopped trying to impose on those around him. But once Elizabeth became queen in 1952, Philip found himself in an awkward constitutional limbo, a man of action with no actual authority. His job was to walk 2 steps behind his wife, wave, smile, and say nothing of consequence. Naturally, he did the opposite. Philip was sharp, intellectually curious, blunt, and mechanically gifted. He read voraciously, asked uncomfortable questions, and championed causes like wildlife conservation and technology long before they were fashionable. He founded the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which encouraged young people to develop skills and resilience. These were not minor contributions. But the public rarely heard about those things first. Instead, they heard the one-liners. He once asked a group of British students in China if they were still throwing spears. He told a Scottish driving instructor that it was no wonder you have so many accidents given the roads. When meeting a group of deaf children at a steelworks, he commented that it was no wonder they were deaf. These remarks, tossed off casually, often with a smirk, walked the line between old-world sarcasm and full-on insult. To some he was a relic, to others refreshingly blunt, to his press officers a recurring PR emergency. But what makes Philip's place on this list particularly complicated is that he wasn't cruel. He was impatient. Impatient with pretense, with bureaucracy, and especially with modern sentimentality. He despised self-pity and loathed the media's obsession with royal emotion. When Diana died, and the public demanded tears from the palace, Philip's instinct was to keep calm and carry on, and his inability to perform grief on cue fed into the public's growing distaste for emotional aloofness. Behind the scenes, however, he was reportedly fiercely loyal. He pushed for modernization inside the palace, demanded better education for his children, and often acted as the family's internal disciplinarian and skeptic. His role was that of a counterbalance. Elizabeth was the symbol, Philip the reality check. He died in 2021 at the age of 99, having lived long enough to see the monarchy pass through near scandal, slow evolution, and a global public increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege. And yet, for all his failings, Philip remains strangely emblematic of the monarchy's contradictions, a man born into royalty, forged in war, shaped by exile, and defined by an institution that never fully knew what to do with him. And if Philip was the royal who never cared what you thought, the next one is his grandson, a man who cares perhaps a little too much. Charming in public, sharp-suited in photos, but, according to whispers behind closed palace doors, not always the Prince of Patience. Get ready for Prince William, Prince of Wales, whose polished image might just be hiding a temper inherited from more than one royal ancestor. 17. Prince William, Prince of Wales. For much of his life, Prince William has been cast as the safe one, the responsible brother, the stable heir, the royal who never veered too far from the script. He was the contrast to chaos, the palace's favorite PR counterweight to a sibling who seemed allergic to discretion. The press, eager for a clean narrative, labeled him the new Diana, a modern prince with his mother's charm and none of his father's baggage. But under the polished surface of charity work, crisis diplomacy, and curated appearances, there's a different picture. One less about calm and more about control. Born in 1982 to the most famously doomed marriage in modern royal history, William grew up in a paradox. He was both the golden child of a fairy tale and the silent witness to its collapse. His childhood was shaped by instability masked as ceremony, family trauma buried under palace walls. It's easy to forget how much of his early life was spent being stared at, not just by press photographers, but by a nation desperate for a narrative. After Diana's death, that scrutiny intensified, and William learned fast what his job would be, not just to endure the monarchy, but to rehabilitate it. For a while he played the part perfectly. He studied at Eton, served in the military, flew rescue helicopters, and married a woman, Catherine Middleton, whose background, poise, and inoffensive glamour made her the most popular addition to the royal family since, well, Diana. Together they became the model modern couple. Middle-class sensibility meets thousand-year-old institution. Even their children looked pre-approved for postage stamps. But behind palace doors, the story isn't quite so serene. Those who've worked with William, quietly of course, describe a temper. Not explosive in the public sense, but sharp, cold, unyielding. He is said to be demanding, especially of staff, with little patience for disobedience or mismanagement. In an institution where deference is the default, William reportedly doesn't hesitate to make it clear who's in charge. That might be expected in a monarchy, but it rubs awkwardly against the public image of the approachable, grounded prince. His relationship with the media is equally complex. Unlike his brother, William didn't try to escape the system. He learned to control it. The palace press machine protects him with the kind of force typically reserved for heads of state. Stories disappear, photos vanish. Journalists know which lines not to cross. In return, William plays his part. But only so far. When pushed, he pushes back. Hard. And then there's the matter of his brother. The rift between William and Harry has been dissected by every media outlet on Earth, but the core of it, if reports are to be believed, lies in William's belief that duty comes before emotion, that the crown is a job, not a therapy session. It's a belief that once bonded them. Now, it divides them. There's nothing criminal or outrageous in William's record. No financial scandal. No exotic crisis. What makes him worthy of this list is subtler. The creeping sense that beneath the charm lies a steel trap. That the Prince of Wales, future king and face of modern monarchy, might be as ruthless in preserving the institution as any of his less polished ancestors, just better at hiding it. Because in the end, William doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. He only needs to outlast everyone else. And he probably will. But while William plays the long game, the next royal spent decades playing all sides. Aloof yet controlling, progressive in speech, and allegedly petty in private. A man born to be king but shaped by decades of waiting, whispering and orchestrating from the sidelines. Now it's finally his reign, for better or worse. King Charles III, formerly Prince Charles, and forever an enigma wrapped in organic cotton. 18. King Charles III. For most of his life, King Charles III was the man forever next in line, the royal always waiting for the curtain to rise while everyone debated whether the play was still worth watching. He spent more than 7 decades rehearsing for a role he was born to inherit, but never quite allowed to perform. And in all that time, he became something rare. A monarch with a long history, a public paper trail, and just enough ambiguity to make nearly everyone unsure what to make of him. Born in 1948, Charles was destined for monarchy from the cradle. But from early on, it was clear he didn't quite fit the mold. Sensitive, cerebral, and introspective, he lacked the easy charm of his mother or the brusque clarity of his father. He was sent off to Gordonstown, a Scottish boarding school famous for cold showers, corporal punishment, and character building via misery, where he reportedly hated every minute. But endure it he did, learning the same lesson he would carry into adulthood, that feelings are best buried and duty is best worn like armor. As Prince of Wales, Charles took on hundreds of public duties, gave thousands of speeches, and launched causes that often made headlines, some admiring, others baffled. He was decades ahead on environmental issues, organic farming, sustainable architecture, and interfaith dialogue. But his enthusiasm was often undercut by a tone that wavered between earnest and elitist. He saw himself as a steward of the planet, the nation, and tradition, but also sometimes as the only one who truly understood what was best for them. Behind the causes, there was also the court intrigue. Charles's relationship with Princess Diana started as a royal fairy tale and ended as an international soap opera. Their incompatibility, emotional, personal, and philosophical, played out in front of a global audience. By the end of the 1990s, Charles's public image had been bruised by scandal, softened only slightly by time, and complicated further by his long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Consort. But where some royals crash and burn, Charles adapted, slowly, awkwardly, but persistently. His PR operation rehabilitated him, and over time, public opinion began to thaw. He leaned into philanthropy, created the Prince's Trust, and focused his attention on a vision of Britain rooted in tradition, but not afraid of buzzwords like sustainability and resilience. He made his image less about glamour and more about guardianship. Still, there are persistent whispers that Charles is petulant behind closed doors, prone to tantrums over trivialities, fastidious to a fault. Former staff speak, anonymously of course, about handwritten memos left on pillows, demands for toothpaste to be squeezed a certain way, eggs boiled to precise timing. Nothing outrageous, just deeply specific, and revealing in their own quiet way. He's a man who waited 70 years for control, and once he got it, was determined to make every inch of it matter. When Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, Charles finally became king. His coronation was both ceremonial and surreal, a man well into his 70s donning the symbols of a job he'd trained for longer than most people live. And while he speaks of service and continuity, there's no ignoring the subtle undertow of self-vindication. This is his monarchy now, shaped not just by birthright, but by decades of deferred ambition. Charles isn't a villain. He's not a hero either. He's something rarer. A monarch whose flaws are unusually well documented, whose anxieties have been published, and whose reign, though only just begun, already carries the weight of being both overdue and uncertain. And if Charles represents the long arc of royal self-preservation, the next royal on our descent never really played the long game, because she preferred instant gratification. Fashion icon, rebel aristocrat, party fixture. Princess Margaret lived as if the rules didn't apply, and then seemed vaguely offended when they did. 19. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret was born into royalty but lived like the monarchy was her personal inconvenience. She had the title, the tiara, and the tabloid attention, but none of the restraint. If Queen Elizabeth II was the embodiment of duty, then Margaret was the footnote in sequins, dragging her cigarette holder through the margins of every rule she didn't feel like following. She was sharp-tongued, stunning, and deeply discontent, a royal with the soul of a nightclub singer and the expectations of a nun. It didn't go well. Born in 1930 as the younger daughter of King George VI, Margaret was never meant to be anything more than the spare. But then, her uncle Edward VIII abdicated, her father became king, and her sister, the quiet, responsible one, became the heir. From that moment on, Margaret's life turned into one long, uncomfortable echo of someone else's destiny. She had the palace, but not the power, the spotlight, but not the script. From the start, Margaret bristled against the constraints of royal life. She was witty, flirtatious, and irreverent in ways that palace staff found exhausting. While Elizabeth studied the Constitution and cultivated a sense of serene neutrality, Margaret studied jazz records and cultivated scandal. Her relationships were frequent topics of gossip, but none more so than her romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a war hero, a divorcee, and, by mid-century royal standards, a walking PR disaster. Margaret wanted to marry him. The public supported it. The monarchy did not. Under Church of England rules, and in the shadow of the abdication crisis, marrying a divorced man while still being a working royal was a bridge too far. Ultimately, Margaret renounced the relationship in a broadcasted statement that was part loyalty pledge, part emotional hostage note. She claimed the decision was hers. No one really believed her. That single moment, public heartbreak for private protocol, set the tone for the rest of her life. She never quite forgave the institution, and she never stopped reminding people that she hadn't. She became the glamorous royal, the one who traveled, drank, smoked, posed, and occasionally insulted guests with such precision that it bordered on performance art. She once told a commoner at dinner, "We have a lot in common. You breathe, and I breathe." When asked what she did for a living, she reportedly replied, "I am a member of the British royal family. We are a dying breed." Margaret said the things other royals merely thought, and then thought even worse things after saying them. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, was supposed to be a modern royal love story. It quickly unraveled into icy cohabitation, extramarital affairs, and a divorce that made headlines in all the wrong ways. She spent much of her later life on private islands, smoking through breakfast and treating duty like an inconvenient scheduling error. She loved the stage, but hated rehearsals. She wanted the crown's privileges without its obligations, and seemed genuinely confused that one was tethered to the other. In time, her health declined, along with her relevance. By the 1990s, she had become a tragic figure, a woman once dubbed the most glamorous princess in the world, now largely remembered for missed chances and smoldering resentment. She died in 2002, just weeks before her mother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, a symmetry that felt strangely poetic, considering how long Margaret had lived in someone else's shadow. Princess Margaret wasn't evil. She was simply born into a system that offered her luxury but not agency. And she responded the way many people would, with defiance, indulgence, and the occasional dramatic flounce out of the room. Her life remains a cautionary tale about what happens when a sharp mind and a restless spirit are trapped inside a golden cage, one that expects you to smile while you pace. And if Margaret was royalty's rebellious party guest, the next monarch was something altogether colder, a queen who reigned with legendary brilliance but also a disconcerting steeliness, ruthless when necessary, solitary by design, and calculating in every alliance and betrayal. Queen Elizabeth I didn't just survive a cutthroat court, she ruled it like a chessboard. 20. Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I is often remembered as one of Britain's greatest monarchs, the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the woman who presided over a golden age of poetry, exploration, and empire. Her portraits hang in stately halls with serene defiance, red wigs aflame, her pale hand resting on globes and scepters like a chess master surveying the board. But look closer, and the myth begins to crack. Because behind the icon was a monarch so calculating, so cold when needed, so adept at weaponizing solitude, that her reign starts to look less like enlightened rule and more like survival by manipulation, with a crown. Born in 1533 to the most controversial marriage in English history, that of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth arrived already shadowed by scandal. Her mother was executed when she was just 2. She was declared illegitimate, then legitimate again, then back to a kind of dignified limbo. She grew up not with the security of royalty, but with the paranoia of someone who knew her neck was only ever a rumor away from the chopping block. That fear, that gnawing sense of being expendable, never left her. It shaped her politics, her personality, and most importantly, her relationships. Elizabeth never married, famously declaring herself wedded to the realm. The romantic version says she rose above worldly love in devotion to her people. The cynical version, and the more human one, suggests that she simply didn't trust anyone enough to share the throne. And with good reason. Every suitor was a potential threat. Every husband, a would-be ruler. Elizabeth didn't want a king, she wanted power, and she kept it with a grip like iron lace. Her court was a masterpiece of psychological theater. Courtiers were drawn into elaborate games of affection and approval. Favorites like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, were raised up, adored, and then ruthlessly sidelined the moment their loyalty wavered or their usefulness faded. She flirted with diplomacy like a cat plays with string, promising alliances, drawing suitors from France, Austria, and Spain, only to ghost them when the balance of power shifted. Her refusals weren't passive, they were performances. But Elizabeth wasn't just aloof. She was brutal when she needed to be. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and one-time rival for the English throne, is a chilling example. Elizabeth agonized publicly over the decision, delayed signing the death warrant, claimed she had been manipulated into it, and yet she signed it. Mary's death wasn't just a security measure, it was a signal. No matter how royal your blood, Elizabeth would not be usurped. She also crushed rebellions with characteristic flair. The Northern Rebellion, the Essex Rebellion, the Irish uprisings. In each case, her response was swift, unapologetic, and frequently lethal. Her tolerance extended only as far as it protected her position. Religious compromise? Yes, until it didn't serve. Dissenters? Tolerated until they got organized. Her image was one of regal poise, but her politics were razor-edged. Even her public persona, the glorious white-painted face, the pearls, the impossibly composed speeches, was an invention. She crafted her image like a myth-maker. She knew the power of symbolism long before political consultants made it an industry. When the Spanish Armada was poised to invade, she donned armor and delivered her speech at Tilbury like a warrior queen. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It was brilliant, and it worked. But it was also carefully rehearsed, emotionally bulletproof, and entirely designed to serve her legend. Elizabeth I reigned for 44 years and died unmarried, childless, and in the final stretch, lonely. Her court thinned, her temper sharpened. She became paranoid, melancholic, and increasingly withdrawn. The image held, but only barely. She gave England glory, yes, but she ruled through fear, flattery, and force. Her genius was not in kindness but control. And while Elizabeth I mastered the art of solitary power, her cousin, and sometime nemesis, Mary, Queen of Scots, operated from a different blueprint entirely. One driven by passion, vengeance, and the fatal belief that royal blood alone guaranteed loyalty. History proved otherwise. 21. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was many things. Monarch, romantic, Catholic, widow, prisoner, mother, martyr. But above all, she was a woman disastrously convinced that being born a queen was the same thing as being built to rule. Where her cousin Elizabeth I wielded power like a scalpel, Mary handled it like a family heirloom, cherished, flaunted, and ultimately shattered. Her story is less a tragedy of fate and more a slow-motion lesson in how charm, entitlement, and the wrong kind of faith in people can turn royalty into ruin. Born in 1542, Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. From the very beginning, she was more symbol than sovereign. Raised in the glittering courts of France, she was bred for diplomacy and marriage, not for navigating the minefield that was 16th century Scottish politics. Her French upbringing gave her polish, language, style, religion, the works, but it also left her tone-deaf to the brutal realpolitik of her homeland. Scotland didn't care about her gowns or her grace. It cared about control. Her first marriage, to the sickly Francis II of France, made her queen consort of France briefly. When he died young, she returned to Scotland in 1561, a Catholic queen in a country increasingly leaning Protestant. A woman schooled in European pageantry now expected to manage feuding clans, hostile nobles, and religious upheaval. It did not go well. Mary's fatal flaw was her belief that being queen meant people would obey her. Instead, they plotted, whispered, and formed factions the moment she landed. Her advisors were inconsistent, her nobles opportunistic, her own judgment increasingly suspect. And then came the husbands. First, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, charming, vain, and deeply unstable. They married quickly, disastrously. He resented her power, she resented his weakness. He was murdered under mysterious circumstances, strangled after an explosion tore through his residence. Suspicion fell on many, but mostly on Mary and the man who became her third husband, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was rough, impulsive, and about as subtle as a siege tower. Marrying him, especially so soon after Darnley's very public demise, was not just poor optics. It was political suicide. Nobles turned against her en masse. Riots broke out. Public opinion, already brittle, snapped. Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI, and fled south to England, seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth. Which brings us to the long, slow fall. Elizabeth, ever the cautious chess player, saw Mary not as kin but as a threat, a Catholic figurehead around whom English rebels could rally. Mary was placed under house arrest for nearly 2 decades, moving from castle to castle, writing letters, weaving plots, and hoping for rescue that never came. Eventually, she got too close to a real conspiracy, the Babington plot, and Elizabeth had the justification she needed. Mary was tried and executed in 1587, but even in death, Mary managed to complicate her legacy. She was composed on the scaffold, draped in red, the color of martyrdom. Her execution turned her from failed queen into romantic legend. Catholics canonized her in all but name. Historians still argue over her guilt, her intentions, her intelligence. The truth? Mary was not stupid. She was reckless. She believed people would love her because of her crown. She thought personal charm could outmaneuver political strategy. She mistook the poetry of monarchy for its reality, and in doing so, she handed her enemies every advantage they needed. If Elizabeth ruled by refusing to trust, Mary fell by trusting too much. The result was the same. One lived, one didn't. But neither ruled unscathed. And while Mary's downfall was shaped by betrayal and bad choices, the next royal was never even given the dignity of choices at all. A man remembered not for what he did, but for what was done to him. A younger brother, an invisible prince, and perhaps the clearest example that even royalty can be erased from its own family tree. Meet Prince Henry, younger brother of King Henry VIII, and an early case study in being born too close to power for comfort. 22. Prince Henry, younger brother of King Henry VIII. In royal history, the spotlight rarely lingers on the ones who didn't make it, the siblings sidelined by fate, the heirs who never inherited, the spare parts of dynasties built on the primacy of one name at a time. Prince Henry, younger brother of King Henry VIII, is one of those quietly forgotten figures, not because he scandalized the monarchy, but because he died before he could. Yet his short life, barely recorded and largely dismissed, serves as an eerie blueprint for how the Tudor court disposed of even its own when they became inconvenient to the grand narrative. Let's clear something up first. When most people hear Prince Henry and Tudor, they immediately think of the notorious king with 6 wives, a reformation, and a temper like a guillotine. But before that Henry became king, there was another Henry, a younger brother to the heir apparent, Prince Arthur, and a younger son to King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He's not to be confused with later Henrys in the royal family tree. This Henry was born in 1496 and lived only 2 months. 2 months. Long enough to be named. Long enough to be a footnote. Not long enough to matter, at least to the grand chroniclers of Tudor glory. But that, in itself, is part of the issue. His death didn't make him infamous. It made him invisible. The records are sparse, almost cruelly so. A few baptismal details, a solemn burial at Westminster Abbey, and then silence. The official story is that he died of natural causes, a victim of the brutal infant mortality rates of the era. No scandal, no rumors, just a quiet vanishing. But his short existence reveals a deeper, darker aspect of the monarchy, the way it handles redundancy. In a court obsessed with lineage, succession, and divine legitimacy, the birth of multiple sons should have been a source of security. In reality, it created anxiety. Spares became risks, lightning rods for factional ambition and potential future rivals to the throne. Had Henry survived, his life likely would have mirrored that of many second sons in monarchies. A ceremonial title, a bishopric perhaps, a military command designed to keep him both useful and far from court. Or worse, he might have become a pawn in marriage politics, carted off to foreign courts as a diplomatic gift, remembered mostly in footnotes and treaties. And yet, in dying so young, he offered his elder brother something uniquely precious in Tudor terms, a clear path. With Arthur's death in 1502 and young Henry's disappearance before he could grow teeth, the way was open for the surviving son, the third-born future Henry VIII, to rise without sibling competition. No alternate claims, no complicated alliances, no other sons of Henry VII to muddy the dynastic waters. It's an ironic twist. The most famous king in English history ascended to power, in part, because the other boys didn't make it. Their absence made him inevitable. And that's the haunting part of Prince Henry's story. Not what he did, but what he never had the chance to do. He was a prince born into the Tudor machine, and like so many cogs that didn't quite fit, he was quietly removed, mourned just enough, and then erased by history that had bigger, bloodier tales to tell. But history doesn't like unfinished pages, and the Tudors, ever aware of legacy, turned every death into a design, which leads us to another royal brother, also eclipsed, also overshadowed, but this one lived long enough to have a name, a narrative, and a legacy so faint that historians still debate what could have been. Prince Arthur, older brother of Henry VIII, was supposed to be king, until death, and history's cruel sense of irony, handed the throne to someone else entirely. 23. Prince Arthur, older brother of Henry VIII. History is littered with the ghosts of monarchs who never were, but few loom larger in the shadows of royal what-ifs than Prince Arthur Tudor. He was born for greatness, named for a legend, and trained from the cradle to rule. England watched him grow with the quiet confidence of a realm that finally had its future secured. He was, for a time, the Tudor dynasty's perfect answer to instability, a legitimate, healthy male heir born in the wake of the Wars of the Roses. His birth was a political statement. His death was a cosmic punchline. Born in 1486, just a year after his father, Henry VII, seized the crown at Bosworth and ended decades of dynastic warfare, Arthur was christened with all the symbolic weight the Tudor family could muster. He wasn't named Henry like his father. He was named Arthur, after the mythical king, as if to say, this isn't just a prince, this is a new beginning, Camelot reborn, destiny in a velvet cradle. And to be fair, Arthur seemed to play the part. Raised at Ludlow Castle as Prince of Wales, he was given the best humanist education of the day. He was described as precocious, devout, and diplomatic. Tutors praised his intellect. Ambassadors wrote glowing reports of his poise and promise. Everything about Arthur, his alliances, his upbringing, even his wardrobe, was curated for kingship. The most important of these alliances came in 1501, when Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The marriage was a political masterstroke. England was still something of a middleweight on the European stage, and this match tied the Tudors to Spain, a heavyweight in every sense. The wedding was grand. The future seemed locked. Then, 5 months later, Arthur died. He was 15. The cause remains debated, likely an illness, perhaps the sweating sickness or tuberculosis. Whatever it was, it moved fast. Within days of falling ill, the heir to England's throne was dead. And just like that, all of Henry VII's carefully laid dynastic plans crumbled. The fallout was immediate and quietly devastating. Catherine of Aragon, now a widow at 16, was left stranded in a foreign court. The Spanish-English alliance wobbled. Henry VII panicked. And young Henry, Arthur's younger brother, until then mostly left to enjoy a relatively carefree princely existence, was suddenly thrust forward into the role he was never supposed to play. The implications of Arthur's death would echo for decades. If Arthur had lived, it's likely Catherine of Aragon would have become Queen of England as planned. But without the bitter annulment, the 6 marriages, and the eventual split from Rome. No Reformation, no Anne Boleyn, no Elizabeth I, no Bloody Mary, no Anglican Church. Arthur's death didn't just change the royal succession, it upended the religious, cultural, and political trajectory of Britain itself. And yet Arthur remains a hazy figure. We have portraits of him that look vaguely interchangeable with every other Tudor prince. We have letters, some dignified, some awkward. We have accounts from courtiers that read more like propaganda than personality. His legacy is one of absence, a crown never worn, a reign never realized, a destiny passed like a baton to a brother who would turn it into a weapon. Prince Arthur isn't remembered for what he did. He's remembered for what he didn't live to prevent. His greatest contribution to history was making room for someone else, someone far less stable, far more famous, and infinitely more destructive. And speaking of destruction, the next entry isn't just a return to a familiar face. It's a darker retelling of a royal who walked away from the throne but never quite left scandal behind. Because if Edward VIII's abdication was his big mistake, what he did afterward was even worse. Re-enter the Duke of Windsor, now in exile, and dangerously bored. 24. The Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, revisited. If the abdication of King Edward VIII was a royal earthquake, his post-abdication life as the Duke of Windsor was the slow, smoldering aftermath. The history books like to tie a bow around 1936 and call it a tragic love story. A man who gave up the crown for the woman he loved. Cue the violins, cue the vintage photographs of cocktails in the south of France. But peel back the silk curtain, and what emerges isn't just a disenchanted former king. It's a portrait of entitlement in exile, a man who walked away from his duty and then spent the rest of his life confused as to why the palace changed the locks. When Edward renounced the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American socialite, divorcee, and one-woman constitutional crisis, he seemed to believe he could keep the lifestyle, minus the responsibility. In theory, he relinquished the crown. In practice, he expected to remain at the center of royal life, just without the paperwork. He imagined himself as a kind of royal freelancer. No throne, no subjects, but plenty of influence. The monarchy, quite sensibly, disagreed. After the abdication, Edward was packed off to Austria and then France, given a title, Duke of Windsor, and a generous allowance, but kept at arm's length. Wallis was never granted royal status. The couple was invited to almost nothing of significance. Edward sulked. Wallis smiled tightly. Together they began a decades-long campaign of subtle grievance, making it very clear to anyone who would listen, and many who wouldn't, that they believed they'd been treated unfairly by the family firm. It didn't help that Edward never really accepted life out of the spotlight. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, posed for photo spreads in Life magazine. He seemed perpetually caught between roles, too royal to be ordinary, too disgraced to be regal. He dabbled in diplomacy, occasionally flirted with politics, and always leaned into the narrative that he'd been wronged by history. And then there's the part of the story that has aged about as well as an unchilled martini. In 1937, Edward and Wallis visited Germany, not Berlin. not discreet diplomatic circles. They met with Hitler, shook his hand, smiled for the cameras. Edward allegedly gave full Nazi salutes, toured factories, and, by all credible accounts, expressed admiration for aspects of the regime. British intelligence and royal aides were horrified. There were whispers, and not so quiet ones, that if the Nazis had successfully invaded Britain, they might have restored Edward to the throne as a puppet king. The idea wasn't some tabloid fever dream. It was actively discussed in German intelligence circles. During World War II, Churchill sent Edward far away to govern the Bahamas, a post clearly designed to keep him busy and irrelevant. He resented it, of course. The Bahamas were not his style. Too hot, too colonial, and far too distant from the social circles where he still believed he belonged. He complained about everything. He wrote letters filled with veiled bitterness and occasionally shocking tone deafness, even as the world burned. After the war, Edward and Wallis returned to a life of perpetual semi-glamour. Paris, parties, dinners with aging aristocrats and American celebrities. They became living artifacts, photogenic but out of place. Edward never stopped missing the crown, and Wallis, despite her diamond collection and sharp wit, never quite forgave the royal family for treating her like a social virus. He died in 1972, largely forgotten by the institution he once led. Wallis followed in 1986, buried beside him in the royal burial ground, a final slightly awkward compromise. Edward VIII's real legacy isn't the romance. It's the slow corrosion of character that followed. The abdication wasn't his downfall. It was just the first exit sign. What came next was decades of vanity, pettiness, and the unmistakable smell of a man who gave up everything, and then spent the rest of his life pretending he never really wanted it. And while Edward faded into self-imposed irrelevance, the next royal on our descent never even got the chance to rebel. His story is short, stifled, and quietly cruel. A boy born into privilege, locked away by that same privilege, and remembered more as a footnote than a person. Prepare to meet Prince John of Wales, the forgotten son of King George V, and the royal family's most inconvenient secret. 25. Prince John of Wales. In a family obsessed with image, order, and the unblinking weight of tradition, Prince John was a problem. Not a scandal, not a traitor, not even a rebel. Just inconvenient. Born in 1905 as the youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, he was royalty by blood but not by function. Unlike his more prominent siblings, the future kings Edward VIII and George VI, John was marked early on as different. Not in temperament or taste, but in health. And in the cold machinery of royal expectation, difference often equaled disappearance. From the start, Prince John was spirited and curious. Photographs show him laughing, playing, climbing trees with his brothers. For a time, he was allowed to be a child like any other royal child, dressed in starched sailor suits, posing stiffly beside toy boats. But by the age of 4 or 5, something changed. He began having seizures. His behavior grew erratic. He became harder to manage, less predictable, and more difficult to include in the tightly choreographed routines of court life. Though never publicly confirmed during his lifetime, historians now widely accept that Prince John had epilepsy, and possibly a developmental or neurological condition on top of that, such as autism. In the early 20th century, neither diagnosis came with understanding or compassion, especially not in aristocratic circles. Medicine treated such conditions with euphemism. Society treated them with avoidance. And the British royal family? They treated it with silence. By the time John was 11, he was almost entirely absent from public life. He was removed from London and sent to live at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a remote cottage where he could be cared for quietly, away from photographers and foreign dignitaries. His primary companions were a nanny, a gardener's daughter, and the household staff. For all intents and purposes, Prince John was exiled, not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of discomfort. The royal family never officially disowned him. They simply stopped talking about him. And that, in many ways, is the point. John's story is not one of public shame or personal failure. It's a tale of erasure, of a family so obsessed with maintaining the perfect image that even a child could become a liability if he didn't fit the frame. When he died at age 13 in 1919, following a severe seizure, he was buried with quiet dignity. His parents mourned, privately. There was no state funeral, no official photographs. Just a brief note in the court circular and a ripple of sadness soon overtaken by other royal duties. Queen Mary wrote that his death was a great shock, though for the poor little boy it is a great release. It's a line that reads more like rationalization than grief. She visited him rarely in his final years. King George V, for his part, once remarked that John was more of an animal than anything else. Whether this was callousness or the brutal vocabulary of a rigid age is up for debate. But the sentiment stands. Prince John's legacy is a silent indictment of the institution that raised and then erased him. He represents the side of royalty that prefers discomfort be hidden, that treats vulnerability as deviation. In modern years, efforts have been made to reintroduce his story, to frame it with compassion, to acknowledge the quiet injustice of it all. But it comes late, as most royal acknowledgments do. John didn't live long enough to be disliked. He simply lived long enough to be forgotten, until forgetting him became more embarrassing than remembering. And with him, our gallery of regal unpleasantness, dysfunction, and historical eyebrow raisers comes to its reluctant close. 25 royals, each with their own brand of ignominy, some comically flawed, others catastrophically self-absorbed, and a few who simply never stood a chance. Together, they paint a picture of monarchy not as fairy tale, but as fragile mythology, one constructed from power, accidents, mistakes, and centuries of very expensive denial.